Okay, so the obvious answer here is in fact the correct answer. Sometimes the obvious answer is not quite correct, but perhaps incomplete. Who's buried in Grant's tomb? Anyone know the answer to that? Grant and Grant's wife. So the obvious answer is partially correct. Sometimes the obvious answer is not correct at all. What animals were the Canary Islands named after? Not canaries, but dogs. That's right. So the obvious answer is the wrong answer here. Now, sometimes the obvious answer, although it may seem obvious enough, it's not just not correct, it's not just incomplete, but actually completely wrong, 180 degrees wrong, dead wrong. And let me tell you about 3 examples of that. So I'll start with an example on SAT scores. So if SAT scores are going down, is that good or bad? Seems like an obvious answer that that's a bad thing. Obviously, you want to get higher SAT scores. So if SAT scores are going down, that's not good. Well, that's not entirely clear. So, in fact, it is true that SAT scores have gone down in the past several decades. SAT reading scores, for instance, in 1972 averaged 530. Last year averaged 497. And 33 points may not seem like that much, but for a national average, for millions of test takers, that's a substantial decline. And whenever there's news of declines in SAT scores, that's always a chance for pundits to get on board about this is a sign of the decline of American education, or even worse, the decline of American students. You know, back in my day, the story goes, you know, we used to read the great books in high school. We would read Moby Dick and stuff like that. And now people don't read anymore. They just Twitter, and all they can read is 140 characters at once. So this is just a sign of education going downhill. Okay, maybe the obvious answer is not quite the right answer here. And to see why that's the case, I have an illustration on SAT scores by state. So I often do this exercise in my classes where I ask students to guess what state do you think has the highest average SAT score of any state in the country. And usually the first guess is Massachusetts. And perhaps this is because we're in a northeastern college. But Massachusetts has, famous colleges and universities. They're a progressive state. They should have good schools, you would think. Another guess people often do is Connecticut. There are lots of rich people who live in New York City, who work in New York, who live in Connecticut. Perhaps they should have good schools. Maybe Vermont. In fact, none of those 3 are near the top state in the country. They're not even in the top half. They're on the bottom half. Then people might guess, well, how about New York? New York seems like they should have good schools. New York is not in the top half. It's not even the top. It's in the bottom 10. Okay, so maybe it's not something from the Northeast. Maybe we should think about, I don't know, the West Coast, maybe California. They should have good schools, right? California, no, they're also in the bottom half. In fact, it's very rare for anyone to pick even anything in the top half, let alone the top 10 or the best state. So let me show you what the answer to this question is. Here's the top 10 states. And people tend to find this surprising, again, perhaps because we're in a northeastern school, but they're all Midwestern states, and so this is perhaps a surprise. But there's some information here that we're missing. This is not the full story. And the information we're missing is what percentage of high school students take the SATs in these different states. This is called participation rate by the College Board. And in the top states with average SAT scores that are high, typically a handful of percent of students, high school students, take the SAT. So from 3 to 7%, so not even 10%. In Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, the northeastern states, pretty much all high school students take the SATs, up to 90% in some states. So this is not a fair comparison here. So in states where very few people take the SATs, especially Midwestern states, what are people taking instead? ACTs, right? So if you take the SATs and you're from one of these states, probably it's because you want to go to school out of state, and probably at perhaps a very selective college, maybe an Ivy League college perhaps, and that's why you're taking SATs. So the 5% or the 3% of people who take the SATs in the top states are a very different population from essentially 90% of all high school students in the Northeast. So this is not a fair comparison. The population is very different. This is also what's happening on a national level. So the percentage of people taking SATs on a national level is also increasing. So in the last 2 decades, which is not that long, it's gone up more than 50%. And you might think, well, that's because there are more students in the country now, and that's actually not what's causing this. So just in the last few years, there's been a decline in the number of high school students, but there's still an increase in the percentage of test takers. Nationally, this is still the case. So right now, do you know what percentage of US adults have a 4-year college degree? Can you guess? That's pretty close. All right, so around 30% is the data I found for the last year. It's around 30%. So that doesn't seem like a lot. But 50 years ago or 60 years ago, 1950, what percentage of Americans do you think had a 4-year college degree? 7%. So 6%. So there's been a large increase in the percentage of people having college degrees, and therefore there's a large increase in the percentage of people taking SATs. And with that increase, you're comparing very different populations previously versus now. And so is the decline in SATs a good thing or a bad thing? I submit it's not a bad thing at all. It's actually a good thing, because what this shows is that college is becoming an opportunity that's valuable for a much larger segment of the US population than it was before. And that's a good thing rather than a decline in American education. Second example, smoking bad for you. Okay, so there's an obvious answer to this, I think, right? Obvious answer. So is that obvious answer right or wrong? Let's look at some data on this. So there was a study done in the mid-70s in England looking at British women, and they weren't specifically looking at smoking. They were looking at health in general, and they did a 20-year follow-up in 1995. So this study lasted for 20 years. And one of the surprising findings that came out of the study was this. By the time of the 20-year follow-up, 24% of the people who smoked in the original study had died. But 31% of the non-smokers in the original study had now died after 20 years. So in fact, it looks like the obvious answer is again wrong. Smoking is actually good for you. You live longer if you smoke, apparently. Buy that? OK, so this is a counter example. In fact, the obvious answer is right. But the obvious answer you get from looking at the data is, in fact, the wrong answer. So here's what we have to do to find the right answer. So we have to look at different ages, the age distributions. And this is the age of the people at the beginning of the study in 1975. So the women who are 18 to 34 years old at the beginning of the study in 1975, who are at the follow-up 38 to 54 years old, of the smokers, 2.8% of them had died by the end of the study. Of the non-smokers, 2.7%. So basically the same rate of death. Very few of those people had died. It's a little bit higher for smokers, but basically it's a tie. Let's look at the next age group. So people who are 35 to 44 at the beginning of the study, and therefore 55 to 64 at the follow-up. So of those people, the smokers, 13% of those smokers had died. Only 6% of the non-smokers had died. So the non-smokers have a big advantage here, almost less than half the death rate of the people who smoked. Next age group, 45 to 54 at the beginning of the study. 21% of the smokers had died. By the end, 15% of the non-smokers had died. So again, the non-smokers are doing better, living longer. Next age group, 44% of the smokers had died, only 33% of the non-smokers. And of the oldest age group, now these are people who are now 85 and up. By the time of the follow-up, most of those people had died for various reasons, 86 versus 85. The smokers are a little bit higher, but again, they're basically about the same. Now, if you look at this age distribution, in every single age group, the smokers are dying earlier. Right? In every single age group, a higher percentage of smokers has died by the time of the 20-year follow-up. Nonetheless, if you add up all the numbers, the higher percentage of non-smokers overall has died. How is that possible? If smokers are doing worse in every single age group, how is it when you combine everyone, the non-smokers are doing worse overall? Yeah, the sample sizes are not the same. In particular, there's a disproportionate number of younger people, younger women in the smoking group. There's a disproportionate number of older women in the non-smoking group. And why is that? Well, one reason is that perhaps there's missing a number of older women in the smoking group because they didn't live that long to begin with. So if you died earlier than age 65, you would not have made it to that oldest age group in the original study. Second, there's a cultural factor here. This is people who are 65 and older at the time of the original study in 1975 were born in 1910 or earlier. And British women did not commonly smoke in people who grew up in 1910, 1920. It was not as culturally common for British women to smoke. It was more common, more societally acceptable for women to smoke later in the century. So those people who started smoking tended to be younger. The non-smokers tended to be older disproportionately. So you're comparing two age distributions that are not matched. The smokers tend to be younger, the non-smokers tend to be older. So it's not a fair comparison, and the non-smokers have the decks stacked against them. But if you look at the age distribution, then you see what the right answer is. And in fact, the obvious answer from looking at the raw data is in fact not correct. It's that non-smokers do in fact live longer. Third example. World War II, how do you protect bombers from being shot down? So the Allies are sending bombers into continental Europe. They're starting in England and flying into, say, Germany or other targets and then returning back to England. Now, when they come back, these bombers often suffer from anti-aircraft fire or flak or bullet holes from enemy fire. And what you want to do is to protect these bombers so that they have a better chance of coming back with the damage that they sustain. So how do you reduce the amount of damage that's sustained by these airplanes? How do you make it safer for these crews? So what they did was they looked at the data and looked at where on the airplane they found damage. Where are the bullet holes? Where's the flak damage? And so on. So you might have a picture that looks something like this. If you mark where the damage occurs on different airplanes, and this is all marked on the same picture, but this is from different airplanes. You may find a bullet hole there, or a shell damage there, and so on. So there are many places where you might find damage on the airplane. And the question is, where do you want to protect the airplane? Where do you add additional armor to fortify the airplane? What places on the plane should you be adding additional armor? What's the obvious answer? So one obvious answer might be where the bullets hit, right? So if that's where the bullets are hitting, that's what you want to protect, because you don't want the bullets to add additional damage there. But in fact, that obvious answer is not correct. And so the right answer is you want to add additional armor where there are no bullet holes. The places that have no red marks, that's where you want to add the additional armor. And why is that? Because the places where the red holes are, where the bullet holes have hit, those planes have come back and they're in your data set. The places where there are no damage, those planes that were damaged in those places did not come back, and that's why they're missing. That's why there are no bullet holes in the, say, in the cockpit, in the tail, in the engines, because the planes that were hit there were exactly the ones that did not make it home. So what you want to fortify is the places with no damage, not the places with damage. Okay, all these examples, I think, have one element in common, which is that missing data is important here. We're missing some crucial information that leads us to the right answer. And the first example with SATs, what we're missing is the participation rate. So what percentage of people are taking SATs? And that's crucial to getting the right answer. In the second example about smoking, we're missing information on the age distributions. And again, you need that information to draw the right answer. In the third example, in airplanes, you're missing information about the ones that do not come back as opposed to the ones that do come back. Okay, so missing data is key here. Now, I'm a statistician. I'm trained in statistics. In statistics, you deal with missing data all the time. This is a pervasive problem. So you're often doing, for example, surveys. If you've been to a restaurant lately or a department store, you look at your receipt, they often have, go to this website, take our survey, how are we doing? Right, you've seen that, right? So you're always doing surveys, and what they're trying to do is collect some data, maybe demographic data, and the complete data set, if everyone answered completely and truthfully, this is what you'd get, right? Maybe they're asking for your gender, your age, your income, and then they're using that to correlate that with their satisfaction at the restaurant or something of that sort. So this is what the complete data set would look like if you could get that. But that rarely happens because usually people will accidentally skip a question. They might not want to reveal their age, and they might want to hide their income. So you get something that looks like this. This is your observed data set. You're missing something. And the blanks are the missing data. Right? And that's something that you're always going to deal with in statistics. Now, I also work in paleontology. My research is in paleontology, so I don't dig up fossils, but what I do is I study the fossil record as a whole and ask how accurate is the fossil record as a representation of the history and evolution of life on Earth. And missing data is very pervasive in paleontology as well. Here's your complete data set. You might have some dinosaurs, an ecosystem, plants, and so on. And your observed data set, what you actually find is something less than that. It's something like this. And everything else is missing. In paleontology, it's probably the case that 99% or more of the data is missing. A lot of the information that you need is missing. So missing data, I think, is key to a lot of these problems. So we live in what's been called the knowledge revolution now. So we had the agricultural revolution, you have the industrial revolution, and now we have the knowledge revolution that's driven by data and information rather than being driven by crops or manufactured goods. So I think it's becoming accepted that we need to look at data. So for instance, in the New York Times, you see articles. There was one with a headline a couple years ago, for college graduates, one word, not plastics, but statistics. That was the headline. And so you'll see interviews with the chief of Google saying he thinks the hot job for the next 10 years is statistics. There was just an article in the New York Times Magazine about a month ago looking at a major department store, and what they were trying to do is to use statistics, use analytics to try to target consumers. So they want to predict what you're going to buy before you buy it, because they want to target you and send you coupons or promotions so that before you buy something, you're going to decide to buy it at their store. Once you've already bought it, you might buy it somewhere else, and then that's too late. They need to get you before you decide where to buy it. So these are all examples of statistics, analytics, data analysis being used, and I think this is something that's become more pervasive. The Moneyball revolution in sports, for instance, is the same idea. So I think the value of looking at data is something that people have come to recognize in the knowledge revolution. The next step in the knowledge revolution, I think, is to look at not just the data you have, but also the data you don't have, the missing data. And I think that's key here, and this is my message perhaps to you, is that the missing data is often the important part, because the missing data is what often can lead you astray in the opposite direction of the right answer and 180 degrees from the truth. Thank you.